Alright guys, so we're officially going to start talking about biology. So first off, let's sort of break that word down, right? So what does biology actually mean? And if we break apart that word into its prefix and suffix, hopefully we know by this point that bio means life, ology means the study of, and so we're really looking at the study of life, what it is, the processes that go into it, the structures that make it up, and how this all fits together and works. The purpose of this particular section really is to kind of give you a big, broad overview of how we organize biology, what are the major structures that go into studying biology, major processes, and really this is going to set the stage for the rest of the school year, and all of these topics that we kind of gloss over here, we're going to spend a lot more time talking about as the year progresses. So, biology is the study of living things, and we're going to try and kind of beef up our vocabulary, get away from using that term living thing, and instead talk about them as organisms. So, this can include botany, zoology, microbiology, ecology, genetics, forensics, anatomy. Biology really, just like chemistry or physics, are these big, broad, overarching terms for these fields of study, and most people, most scientists within those fields aren't just a biologist. They're going to specialize much more than to just study biology in general. So a botanist might study plants. Zoology is somebody, or a zoologist is somebody who studies animals. Microbiology studies things like viruses and fungus and bacteria. And even within those particular more narrow bands of this field are even more specific specialties, but they all encompass studying living things. So if I'm going to study biology, I need to understand that living things really do range in size. And so we can talk about studying life at a microscopic scale, meaning I need something like a microscope to be able to see them, so they're very tiny, very small, and even things like viruses are part of biological studies, and I can't even see them with a microscope, they're so small. All the way up to more macroscopic or larger scale levels of the entire organism, or I can go bigger and talk things like ecosystems or even the entire biosphere, the entire Earth as a whole. And so my study of biology really can range depending on what my specialty is, what my question for a particular experiment is. So really there's a huge range at which biology can be studied. So some biologist questions may be these big macroscopic level questions where I'm studying the entire globe as a whole and I need things like satellites to give me data from Earth, all the way to the opposite extreme where I'm looking at really powerful microscopes and looking at the most smallest particles of living organisms like bacteria or viruses, in which case I'm on the opposite end of that spectrum, or anywhere in between. So how do we define what a living thing is then? If it can be this really big scale project all the way down to these really tiny, tiny pieces, we need some sort of common language to decide what actually is a living thing. How do I define it? So there's a handful of characteristics that scientists have sort of put out there that anything that we're trying to determine as being a living thing needs to meet all of these criteria. And take note that I said all of them. First and foremost, they have to be made up of cells. And that can mean that they're unicellular, so it's a single-celled organism, something like a bacteria, or it can be multicellular like us, where we've got lots and lots of cells that are all working together to make us function. The other thing that living things need to do are be able to obtain and use energy. So they need to be able to get energy out of their environment and use it. Typically, another word we could throw here is that they need a metabolism. They need to be able to take in food, or if I'm a plant, take in things like sunlight, use that energy, convert it into then forms that my body can actually use. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about a molecule called ATP this year, or adenosine triphosphate. And that really is our big energy currency for living organisms. They have to be able to grow, develop, and change over time. And here we're talking about individual organisms. So even a single bacterial cell is going to grow over its lifetime. Think about you. You didn't start off your life looking like you do sitting in the classroom today. You started off as an egg plus a sperm, and those cells started dividing. You eventually were born as an infant and have grown, changed, and developed into the person that you currently are. We've also got to respond to surroundings. So some sort of stimuli in your environment or even internally can cause a response. So think about something like temperature. You go outside and it might be 95 degrees out in the middle of the summer, and so you start sweating. Your body is responding to that temperature change. You wake up in the morning and it's because mom flipped your lights on. Well, what's your response? You tighten your eyes even harder. You maybe pull the covers over your head. You're responding to that stimuli of light because your eyes haven't dilated quite yet in order to compensate for that amount of light now coming in. You have to be able to reproduce. At the end of the day, biology, you're going to find a lot of it's about reproduction. And you have to have at least the ability to reproduce, to make offspring. Not that necessarily that individual organism has to physically do it or physically be able to reproduce, but all the organs and things like that need to be in place for the possibility of reproduction. They also all have very similar chemicals, and most of what we're going to talk about is that they're based on a universal genetic code. And that's where these molecules, DNA and RNA, come in. If you don't know what those molecules are quite yet, we'll kind of go over a brief overview here, but we'll also spend lots of time talking about how those molecules interact and work and function in your body over the course of this year. And so we can organize all of this into certain levels. So biggest level of organization, the most encompassing, we're talking about your biosphere, right? So this is going to include the Earth as a whole and all the living things that are living there. What's smaller than your biosphere, we talk about individual biomes. So splitting up the globe into places, into things that have similar climates, have similar niches. Maybe the organisms aren't the same, but the jobs and the roles that they perform in those biomes are similar. Get even smaller than that, and we talk about ecosystems, although be careful because we often use the same terminology to talk about a biome as we do an ecosystem, right? So a rainforest, a desert, tropical coral reef, all of those are technically ecosystems if we're talking about them at a specific location on the Earth, so something like the Amazon rainforest or the deserts in the southwest of the U.S. But we also use those terms desert and tropical rainforest for biomes, so just be careful. Biome is a little more all-encompassing. Ecosystem would be a more specific location for that particular type of climate and organism ecosystem. Smaller than that, we go down to your communities. So remember that communities are your just biotic material, right? So ecosystems are biotic living plus the abiotic stuff. So climate, weather, rocks, water, all that non-living stuff, as well as the living organisms that are there. Communities, we take it one step more specific, and now I'm talking just about the living things that are in that particular location. Get even smaller, we talk populations. So here now is just a single species living in that ecosystem. So while a community might be the maple trees and the birch trees and the squirrels and the cardinals and the rabbits and the white-tailed deer, a population, now I'm going to narrow it down to one species. So let's just say we're just talking about a population of cardinals. Alright, so single species living in the same area at the same time. Gets smaller than that, now we're down to an individual organism, so say an individual cardinal that we're studying, and then we can break it down even further than that, so going down to organ systems within that particular organism. So the digestive system, respiratory system, the nervous system. All of these are made up of organs that work together to keep that organism functioning, living, doing its job every day. Those organs, though, are also made up of different tissues. So if we talk about your brain, for example, you've got white matter, gray matter. These are different tissue types that are functioning and working together to make sure that your brain can do its job every day. But even those tissues then are made up of individual cells, so individual neurons, for example. And yet we can get even smaller than that. In fact, we could insert into, between that cell and DNA, organelles, so things like mitochondria, Golgi, apparati, chloroplasts, all these internal structures, and then we can also include the DNA and genes that ultimately give the instructions to make that cell function. Get any smaller than a cell, and we're not really talking about living things anymore, but that doesn't mean that they aren't still made up of smaller building pieces, right? So your cells, your DNA, your genes, they're all made up of atoms. So protons, neutrons, electrons, we can go even further there, and realistically there's even smaller particles than that. But if we take a look, here's where we're talking about that range in which biologists can study life. I can go all the way up to these big biosphere global questions and global studies, all the way down to molecules and compounds and atoms that make up those compounds, and look at how those things get pulled apart in chemical reactions to make your body function on a regular basis. So let's go through a little bit more depth, right? So biosphere, this is the biggest level at which I can study life, and I'm talking about the entire planet or parts of the planet that are ultimately inhabited by living things. So we can talk about terrestrial parts of our biosphere, aka the land, in which these organisms live on, feed on, live in. Or we can talk about aquatic, and talk about the bodies of water, so things like lakes, ponds, the ocean, etc. If I'm studying the biosphere as a whole, this is typically going to mean that I'm a scientist who's going to need to gather my data from space. And with satellite technology, it makes it really useful because I can take these pictures, I can get this data from space. Things like maybe I'm studying the amount of photosynthesis that's going on in forests on the continent, and how is that changing over time? Well, I might look at satellite imagery and look at these dark regions, assume they're forests on the continent, and so I can sort of map out what percentage maybe of the total biosphere is made up of these forests. Maybe that's some data that's useful for a question that I'm asking. We go even smaller, right, and that biome then is the division of the biosphere itself, right? So things like your tundras, your deserts, your forests, your savannas. Okay, where an ecosystem, remember I just mentioned before, is a little more specific. So let's just say the biome as a whole are these deserts. An ecosystem then might be a very specific desert itself. So something like the Sahara, in Africa, for example. And an ecosystem is taking the community of all these living things along with all of those non-living features. So it's not just the living organisms, but the water, the soil, the rocks, the climate, all of those things that then ultimately support that living community itself. So it's biotic plus abiotic. And your ecosystems can really vary in and of themselves, right? They can be terrestrial, like your deserts, your rainforests, your grasslands. But we often forget that ecosystems also exist in aquatic environments as well, and typically we'll split those guys out in freshwater, so things like lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, versus the oceanic ecosystems we're going to see, which in and of itself is also very widely diverse, from coral reefs to organisms who live in intertidal zones to organisms who live out in the open ocean. And the abiotic factors that contribute to their life will also be different based on where those organisms are found. The combination, though, of all those ecosystems or biomes ultimately makes up our biosphere, so that's sort of where that piece fits in. We go down to organisms, and remember this is another word for a living thing, and we're going to try to use the term organism more this year as we continue to expand our biological vocabulary. And we consider things like plants, animals, bacteria. These are all organisms, and we can get more specific within each category. You are an organism. You are a living thing. You fit all the criteria of what it means to be a living organism. Some of them are very small, like the strep bacteria that you see in the picture, in which case you may hear them called microorganisms. So these are typically things that we need a microscope to see, but they are living and meet all of those criteria, all of those characteristics in and of themselves. And keep in mind that the interactions of those organisms ultimately makes every ecosystem that they live in dynamic. The biotic processes that are going on because of these living organisms does impact the abiotic material. Usage of water because of a tree, or grass stopping mudslides, things like that. Those are going to make a difference in how those ecosystems function. And removing organisms from those ecosystems also has an impact on the abiotic side as well. And then we can break you down even further. So multicellular organisms then also have their own levels of internal organization. The cells being the smallest at which we can talk about still retaining all of those characteristics of life, but tissues that then work together, something like the cardiac muscle that you see here, being made up of cardiac muscle cells, those working together as part of an organ, in this case the heart, and then that heart being part of your cardiovascular system, along with things like your arteries and veins to make sure that material is capable of moving around your body. Cells. So this is the smallest unit of structure and function for a living thing. If I break down a cell any further, which of course I can, there's building pieces for it, but any smaller and those individual pieces no longer retain all of the characteristics of life, and so I can't consider them individually as living things. Okay? So every organism is made up of at least one cell. We are organisms who are multicellular, so we are made up of more than one cell. Interesting, just little tidbit of information, it might take more than 700 plant cells to reach across a penny. So just to give you some context of how small a plant cell is, that's crazy, right? So 700 plant cells just to reach across from one end of the penny to the other. And those are actually eukaryotic cells, and So bacteria, there would be even more. They're even smaller than that. And keep in mind that every cell, in and of itself, both size and structure, is dictated by the way that it functions. So even if I look at different bacteria, their structures are a little different based on the jobs that they do in their ecosystem. I look in you, and you've got all sorts of different types of cells that make you up, from that cardiac muscle cell we just talked about in your heart to the neuron in your brain, and their structure is specific to the job that they are supposed to be doing for the organism itself. And then there's still stuff smaller than that, right? Now this is where the characteristics of living things are all met, but there are still building pieces to those cells. So organelles, all right, these are the building pieces to that cell. So things like your mitochondria, which help produce energy, to your nucleus, which stores your genetic information, and all of those things also have their own job. So the nucleus happens to be your biggest one in your cell if your cell has it. All right, not every cell out there does contain a nucleus, and we'll talk about that a little later. But your nucleus as a whole, if we're talking about a cell that has one, typically is referred to as your control center, because this is where all of your instructions, if you want to think of it that way, are housed, and they're housed in, well, your DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. So this is a molecule, compound, otherwise known as DNA, and it is the chemical responsible for your inheritance. So you get half your genetic information from both parents, and that combination then works in your cells in different ways to tell that cell what to do as it functions on a daily basis, and when to do things, when not to do things, how to do different things, what molecules to create, when to create them. And we'll spend a decent amount of time in the spring talking specifically about how these processes all occur. And your DNA in and of itself is broken down into these units of hereditary information called genes. So you have a gene for eye color because that stretch of DNA gives your eyes the instructions to be blue or to be green. Your hair, same deal. You've got a gene for hair color. And because you inherited a certain set of DNA, a certain code, your body is told how to make your hair blonde or brunette or redhead, being a redhead. So they're all in these discrete little packages. Think of DNA as kind of being like your textbook, right? And so those genes are the individual chapters or even individual sections in each chapter that then give you information on how to study biology. Well, DNA kind of works the same way. If DNA collectively in your cells is the textbook, the genes then are those little pieces of information that help tell the cell how to function and what to do. So if I throw these guys all into a pyramid and sort of look at them as the base being the biggest or most encompassing, getting smaller as you go up, biosphere is going to be at the bottom. It's going to be the largest piece. It's going to be the most encompassing of everything above it. And each level of that pyramid as we go up gets a little bit smaller because it gets a little bit more specific, all the way up to things like atoms, and you could even throw protons, neutrons, and electrons all the way at the tippy top above that atom, being even smaller building blocks, subatomic building blocks for an atom.